Welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. At the last minute, just hours before expiration, South Korea decided to temporarily extend an intelligence sharing agreement with Japan. Seoul says the decision was made as Tokyo agreed to reopen talks on settling the bilateral trade dispute. The U.S. has been pushing both countries to save the agreement. Today, we look at the ramifications of the latest decision.
언제든지 한일 군사 비밀 정보 보호 협정의 효력을 종료시킬 수 있다는 전제하에 종료 통보의 효력을 정지시키기로 하였으며
韓国もそうした戦略的観点から判断をしたのだろうと思います。
In the studio with me today, Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, the chairman of the Korea Society and senior director of the McLarty Associates. He served as U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Korea from 2001 to 2004. Also joining me, Mr. Scott Snyder, director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. His latest book, South Korea at the Crossroads, charts the evolution of South Korean foreign policy and strategic choices. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador, South Korea at the last minute temporarily extended Jisomia and also managed to include Japan's trade actions in its logic. Do you consider this a smart diplomacy?
Well, yes, I do. I think it is a very welcome development as far as U.S. diplomacy is concerned. We have been very worried about the deterioration in relations between the Republic of Korea and Japan, our two key allies in Northeast Asia. And we were particularly worried about the pending Korean decision to withdraw from Jisomia because, one, it was a very real symbol of our mutual, our trilateral stake in facing North Korea and dealing with the problems that it poses. And secondly, it was a very practical military agreement that has been very useful to both countries and to the United States during a period where North Korea has been testing missiles, particularly testing short-range missiles. So it's a good decision symbolically, and it's a good decision practically. And I think it's good that the two countries seemingly have found a diplomatic solution to at least postpone what seemed to be a pending crisis over a legal dispute and over history.
Right. And Mr. Snyder, as Ambassador pointed out, this was a postponement. So is this still meaningful, this temporary decision? Because we already had a 3-month grace period.
I do think it's a meaningful decision because the problem that the South Korean government, the immediate problem that the South Korean government faced is that they had created an artificial deadline that was too early for the issue to actually gain momentum toward resolution. And so what the South Korean government has done has been to buy time to allow for hopefully a workable solution that also includes better understanding with regard to the government of Japan's approach on how it views South Korean export controls. But also I think there's one other thing that's very important in terms of benefits to the South Korean government, and that is that the government of Japan had made the argument that they didn't trust South Korea, and that was used as a pretext by the South Korean government for potential renewal. But I think that by postponing the non-renewal, what the South Korean government has done has been to challenge the Japanese assertion that South Korea is not trustworthy. And that's very important because I think that if the agreement had not been renewed, they would have been proving the argument of the government of Japan that maybe South Korea was not trustworthy.
And Ambassador, the United States have been signaling strong messages to both South Korea and Japan to continue the Jisomia. So do you think U.S.'s efforts had played a role in South Korea reversing its decision? And do you also think Japan has also felt the pressure?
Well, yes, I think the U.S. did play a big role. Very senior officials have raised this issue with the Korean government as well as with the Japanese government. We've made clear that that as an ally, we considered it very important that this agreement remain in effect. And obviously, we have a stake in Jisomia. So I'm very I think the U.S. government is very relieved about this decision. I personally think perhaps we should have said more about the Japanese decision. Even though they deny it, I think it is very clear that the decision to take Korea off its list of reliable countries in terms of some strategically important products is, I think we should have been more critical of Japan for doing that. I think that was a disappointment to us.
If I could add to that just a little bit. It's very clear that the U.S. took a public pressure route with South Korea, but I think that there also was a private pressure route with Japan. And I think that in South Korea, that's a point that has been missed because it has been private. And if there was and I agree that if there was a mistake in the way that the U.S. government handled it, it might have been to allow the perception that the U.S. was leaning too far toward the Japan position. Because of the pressure that was being put on South Korea.
And Ambassador, South Korea's decision to temporarily extend Jisomia, would this somehow positively impact the current burden-sharing negotiations between Washington and Seoul?
I hope so. I think for Korea to have withdrawn from Jisomia, I think would have complicated the very difficult process of coming to agreement on burden sharing. So this will create a better atmosphere. I'm not sure whether in a practical sense it will make the process easier, but the atmosphere will be more positive.
I think they have a tougher job than before, and their position is tougher than before. Because it's very clear that the U.S. demands in terms of burden sharing have greatly expanded. And the U.S. is trying to add new categories to the formula for burden sharing that has not been part of the discussion previously. And clearly that discussion didn't go well. The government of South Korea has, I think, essentially rejected the idea that these new categories should be included. And so we're kind of at a standoff with very little time left to get an agreement. And I hope that the U.S. side will look carefully at what they have proposed and reconsider, because the reports suggest that it's way out of line from what really is feasible in terms of enhancing a South Korean contribution for U.S. forces in Korea.
So there's a significant divide between Washington and Seoul over how much South Korea should shoulder. What do you think is the reasonable rate of increase?
Well, I'm not sure I want to try to say exactly what would be reasonable, but I agree with Scott that our sudden demand for what seems to be a five-fold increase in the Korean contribution is unrealistic, and I think excessive. We do need to find a compromise. I think the compromise needs to be more than Korea is contributing now. We need to find maybe find some kind of phasing increase, but to suddenly ask for a five-fold increase, I think is politically impractical.
And Mr. Snyder, there are concerns that about South Korea's public sentiment, and recently 47 South Korean lawmakers signed on to a statement condemning the Trump administration for its approach to the SMA. And this is out of 300 South Korean lawmakers. What do you make of this statement?
Well, we should take that as a signal, because the South Korean lawmakers are the ones who are going to be ratifying the cost-sharing agreement on the South Korean side. It cannot go forward without support in the South Korean National Assembly. And I would also contrast this, kind of expression of objection with the high level of support among the South Korean public for the U.S.-Korea relationship. And we risk squandering that political capital if we persist in taking an approach that both sides can't see as reasonable in terms of finding a way to cut the difference.
And Ambassador Hubbard, Ambassador Harris called a number of South Korean lawmakers and emphasized that South Korea should shoulder $5 billion for the host nation support. And is this part of the difficult job of being an ambassador? How was it for you? I mean, back then, President Bush named North Korea an axis of evil, and there were many events. So how was it?
Well, I think the role of an ambassador is obviously to represent his country and to carry out the foreign policy of the United States. And we're seeing that process illustrated very dramatically during these impeachment hearings that we're undergoing now and about our diplomacy vis-a-vis Ukraine. I think what ambassadors can do best, and I think what I tried to do, was create an atmosphere of trust and understanding between the two governments that will allow the negotiators to carry out their task. And in this case, as Scott has said, the task is quite difficult because our demands are very heavy and very hard for the Korean government to carry out. So I wouldn't give Ambassador Harris any advice on how to support his president's policy, how public he should be in carrying out that policy. But I hope and trust that as we go forward, that we'll have an atmosphere in which the two sides can move closer together on this difficult issue of SMA, and I do hope that this decision on Jisomiya will help create that positive atmosphere.
Pentagon was quick to dismiss South Korean reporting that U.S. will pull out a brigade, 4,000 U.S. soldiers, if South Korea does not shoulder more cost sharing. So why do you think DoD was so quick to dismiss this report?
Well, I think that the report contradicts the message of assurance that the Pentagon always wants to give. And I think the interesting thing about that report is that it came following, I would say, a less than strongest expression with regard to the U.S. presence by Secretary of Defense Esper. If he had made a stronger expression earlier, then I think it might have deflected that kind of report. But I think we have to take it seriously. It reflects an issue in terms of environment around the alliance relationship and alliance management right now because of the SMA and because of all the other questions between the U.S. and South Korea on alliance management.
And before we go, Ambassador, so there are ups and downs in U.S.-ROK relations, and when you're ambassador, the progressive government in South Korea, Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, how could you compare that period to the current period where many people say we're going through many difficulties?
Well, I went through a rather difficult period in which we had a conservative government in the U.S. under President Bush, and successive progressive governments in Korea under Kim Dae-jung and later Roh Moo-hyun. And we had some serious issues. We had, the question of Iraq and to what degree would Korea support our effort in Iraq. We had questions arising from the differences over North Korea, kind of illustrated in the axis of evil issue. And then finally, we had a very tragic accident where two young Korean girls were killed accidentally killed under a U.S. military vehicle. So we had a lot of issues to deal with. I think public attitudes towards the United States during that time, Korean public attitudes were much more harsh. I think particularly after the two young girls died, and we saw all these massive demonstrations in Korea, and that had an impact on public attitudes in the United States. I think both President Kim Dae-jung and President Rowe recognized the importance of the alliance and tried to work in practical ways to maintain the strength of the alliance, even as we went through those difficulties. And in a way, the alliance emerged stronger because these progressive leaders recognized its importance. We've had a different kind of challenge this time, where we have a different set of problems. And to be frank, we have a president of the United States who is less predictable than the president I served, George W. Bush, was. He has raised some questions about alliances, and it's made clear that he wants our allies, not just in Korea, but around the world, to pay more. So this time I think we're having a bit of a challenge from the U.S. side, and again, I think the Jisomiya decision we learned of today will help us put that alliance trust back together.
Well, on that positive note, we'll leave our discussion here and move on to our next discussion.
The person who needs to negotiate with me in North Korea is the first Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, Choi Sun-mi.
Chief U.S. nuclear negotiator Stephen Biegun, now set to take up the #2 position at the State Department, urged North Korea to seize the moment and invited Vice Foreign Minister Choi Sun-mi to be his counterpart. Now, Ambassador, Representative Biegun invited Choi Sun-mi to come to the table. Do you think this is a pushback to North Korea's recent string of statements emphasizing the year-end deadline?
Well, I really see it as a hope that in the next round of talks we have with North Korea, that Ambassador Secretary Biegun will have a more authoritative counterpart than he has had in the last few rounds. The North Koreans have made clear that Choi Sun-mi is the key official in dealing with the U.S. on these nuclear issues. Yet Steve Biegun has not been able to meet with her, ostensibly because she has the rank of vice minister and he was only a special envoy. So I think he is hopeful that he'll get a better prepared counterpart the next time he talks to the North Koreans, and that will begin to make more progress than we have in the past.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, Vice Foreign Minister Choi actually said in Russia that denuclearization is now off the table. Do you anticipate working level talks to be held within this year?
Well, the North Koreans have been trying to put a lot of pressure on the U.S. With this end-of-year deadline. But what we have not yet heard from the North Koreans is a private response to what the U.S. put on the table in Stockholm. And I really think that it's important for the North Koreans to go ahead and give us some kind of private response. I think the intensity of the messaging with regard to the deadline is very clear. And so it means they're trying to ramp up pressure. They're trying to approach this from a position of strength. I do think that there is also a window for additional dialogue.
Mm-hmm.
I believe we have a very different situation now. When you use the term working level talks, Steve Biegun is not working level. Mm-hmm. You know, he's Deputy Secretary of State, a very senior official, and that's the level of talks we seem to be looking for. Mm-hmm. And so the North Koreans really no longer have an excuse to try to avoid talks with Biegun.
Mm-hmm. And Mr. Snyder, what do you make of North Korea? First, the State Affairs Committee, and then Mr. Kim Gae-gon, now taking aim at President Trump for the first time, drastically changing its attitude from before. Why do you think they're taking aim at President Trump now and saying that they will not give President Trump something to brag about?
Well, I think that it really reflects their dissatisfaction with the way that President has portrayed his interaction with Kim Jong-un and the way that he's used that relationship as an evidence of success because, you know, the North Koreans haven't gotten paid. And so essentially, I think that's what the North Koreans are saying is, you know, we can also make life difficult for you, President Trump. And by the way, there are promises that we regard as unfulfilled. You know, pay up and give us what we want, or we're going to make trouble. Essentially, it's a very, in a way, it's a very crude framing of the demand as it relates to the message to the president.
I think the North Koreans are trying every way to put pressure on the United States and on President Trump specifically, without kind of going beyond the understandings we reached a year and a half ago in Singapore. You know, in the past, if they wanted to get our attention, they would fire an intercontinental missile or something, or test a nuclear weapon. This time, they're taking much smaller steps to try to put pressure on us without breaking out of this process that is ongoing. And I guess they tell us there's a year-end deadline. I think we have to take it seriously, but I don't think we have to be intimidated by it either. I think the North Koreans still see value in this process.
And Mr. Snyder, why do you think Special Representative Began emphasized that the window is still open and North Korea has to seize the opportunity, yet the United States will not be bound by the year-end deadline?
That's right. Special Representative Began specifically called it an artificial deadline. I think he's resisting the framing of the North Koreans. He's trying to show that we're not going to be bound by it, and yet we're serious about having a discussion. Because after all, the challenge is actually to reorient the North Koreans from their trajectory of trying to become recognized as a nuclear state and get them back on a denuclearization track. It really is going to definitely require diplomacy. And the other facet is the U.S. and North Korea are still engaged in a pressure competition to shape the strategic environment of the other side. And so we have to resist North Korea's efforts while applying our own efforts to shape North Korea's strategic environment.
Well, we'll end our conversation here and now move on to our next segment. Now time for the photo moment, time to look at an interesting North Korea picture. Today we have a photo of the parents of former American hostage, Mr. Otto Warmbier, holding a news conference in Seoul. Mr. Otto Warmbier died after being released from North Korea in a coma in 2017. The parents say they are committed to finding and shutting down illicit North Korean business assets around the world to hold Pyongyang accountable for widespread human rights abuses. Mr. Snyder?
Well, the story related to the Warmbier visit was primarily that President Moon decided not to visit, not to meet with the parents, that he was too busy. And I think that's unfortunate in terms of South Korean human rights policy. But I also think that the Warmbiers have emerged as the most active personification of an aggrieved party related to North Korea's human rights abuses. And so this is going to be a persistent theme. I think the North Koreans, in their handling the Warmbier case, have really created a problem for themselves that is not going to go away.
Ambassador Hubbard?
Well, I agree with what Scott just said. I think this photo is very poignant, and the vision we had on television of Otto Warmbier, in his sports coat, going through the humiliation, and I'm sure the terror of being put on trial in North Korea was very stunning to all of us. I agree that the Warmbiers are a reminder of what we're dealing with North Korea, dealing with a regime that is ruthless beyond all imagination, and we need to keep this very much in mind as we go forward with this process.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Ambassador Hubbard, Mr. Snyder, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eunjang Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea.